Welcome to our continuing series, Questions and Answers for a World in Crisis. Today, Personal Effort, Part 2. Perhaps the main purpose of this question and answer series is not only to give an overview of the subject in the words of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, but to encourage all to look further into their writings. For often there are dozens of pages of quotations that we are unable to cover due to time limitations. From Sri Aurobindo, continued. In the end, his own will and force become one with the higher power. He merges them in the divine will and its transcendent and universal force. He finds it thenceforward presiding over the necessary transformation of his mental, vital, and physical being, with an impartial wisdom and provident effectivity of which the eager and interested ego is not capable. It is when this identification and this self-merging are complete that the divine center in the world is ready. Purified, liberated, plastic, illumined, it can begin to serve as a means for the direct action of a supreme power in the larger yoga of humanity, or superhumanity, of the earth's spiritual progression, or its transformation. Always, indeed, it is the higher power that acts. Our sense of personal effort and aspiration comes from the attempt of the egoistic mind to identify itself in a wrong and imperfect way with the workings of the divine force. It persists in applying to experience on a supernormal plane the ordinary terms of mentality, which it applies to its normal experiences in the world. In the world, we act with the sense of egoism. We claim the universal forces that work in us as our own. We claim as the effect of our personal will, wisdom, force, virtue, the selective, formative, progressive action of the transcendent. In this frame of mind, life, and body, enlightenment brings to us the knowledge that the ego is only an instrument. We begin to perceive and feel that these things are our own, in the sense that they belong to our supreme and integral self, one with the transcendent, not to the instrumental ego. Our limitations and distortions are our contribution to the working. The true power in it is the divine's. When the human ego realizes that its will is a tool, its wisdom, ignorance, and childishness, its power, an infant's groping, its virtue, a pretentious impurity, and learns to trust itself to that which transcends it, that is its salvation. The personal will of the sadhaka has first to seize on the egoistic energies and turn them towards the light and the right. Once turned, he has still to train them to recognize that always to accept, always to follow that. Progressing, he learns, still using the personal will, personal effort, personal energies, to employ them as representatives of the higher power and in conscious obedience to the higher influence. Progressing yet farther, his will, effort, energy, to become no longer personal and separate, but activities of that higher power and influence at work in the individual. But there is still a sort of gulf or distance which necessitates an obscure process of transit, not always accurate, sometimes even very distorting, between the divine origin and the emerging human current. At the end of the progress, with the progressive disappearance of egoism and impurity and ignorance, this last separation is removed. All in the individual becomes the divine working. The full recognition of this inner guide, master of the yoga, Lord, light, enjoyer and goal of all sacrifice and effort, is of the utmost importance in the path of integral perfection. It is immaterial whether he is first seen as an impersonal wisdom, love, and power behind all things, as an absolute manifesting in the relative and attracting it, as one's highest self and the highest self of all, as a divine person within us and in the world, in one of his or her numerous forms and names, or as the ideal which the mind conceives. In the end, we perceive that he is all, and more than all these things together. The mind's door of entry to the conception of him must necessarily vary according to the past evolution and the present nature. This inner guide is often veiled at first by the very intensity of our personal effort and by the ego's preoccupation with itself and its aims. As we gain in clarity and the turmoil of egoistic effort gives place to a calmer self-knowledge, we recognize the source of the growing light within us. We recognize it retrospectively as we realize how all our obscure and conflicting movements have been determined towards an end that we only now begin to perceive. How even before our entrance into the path of the yoga, the evolution of our life has been designedly led towards its turning point. For now, we begin to understand the sense of our struggles and efforts, successes and failures. At last, we are able to seize the meaning of our ordeals and sufferings, and can appreciate the help that was given us by all that hurt and resisted, and the utility of our very falls and stumblings. We recognize this divine leading afterwards, not retrospectively, but immediately, in the molding of our thoughts by a transcendent seer, of our will and actions by an all-embracing power, of our emotional life by an all-attracting and all-assimilating bliss and love. We recognize it too in a more personal relation that from the first touched us, or at the last seizes us. We feel the eternal presence of a supreme master, friend, lover, teacher. We recognize it in the essence of our being as that develops into likeness and oneness with a greater and wider existence. For we perceive that this miraculous development is not the result of our own efforts. An eternal perfection is molding us into its own image. One who is the Lord, or Ishvara, of the yogic philosophies, the guide in the conscious being, Chaitya, Guru, or Antaraman, the absolute of the thinker, the unknowable of the agnostic, the universal force of the materialist, the supreme soul and the supreme Shakti, the one who is differently named and imaged by the religions, is the master of our yoga. To see, know, become, and fulfill this one in our inner selves and in all our outer nature was always the secret goal, and becomes now the conscious purpose of our embodied existence. To be conscious of Him in all parts of our being, and equally in all that the dividing mind sees as outside our being, is the consummation of the individual consciousness. To be possessed by Him and possess Him in ourselves and in all things is the term of all empire and mastery. To enjoy Him in all experience of passivity and activity, of peace and of power, of unity and of difference, is the happiness. From the Mother. Sweet Mother, here it is written, but so long as the lower nature is active, the personal effort of the sadhaka remains necessary. I didn't understand here, so long as the lower nature is active. How? Mother, generally, the lower nature is always active. It is only when one has surrendered completely that it stops being active. When one is no longer in his lower consciousness, when one has made a total surrender, then the lower nature is no longer active. But so long as it is active, personal effort is necessary. In fact, so long as one is conscious of one's own self as a separate person, personal effort has to be made. It is only when the sense of separation is lost, when one is not only completely surrendered, but completely fused in the divine, that there is no longer any need of personal effort. But so long as one feels that one is a separate being, one must make a personal effort. This is what he calls the activity of the lower consciousness. Outwardly, one believes in one's own personality and one's own effort. So long as you believe in personal effort, you must make a personal effort. There is one part of the being which is not at all conscious of being a part of the divine. The whole of the outer being is convinced that it is something separate, independent, and related only to itself. This part of the being must necessarily make a personal effort. It can't be told the divine does the sadhana for you, for it would never do anything. It would never be changed. When one speaks with somebody, one should use his language, shouldn't one? Like all things in the human ascent, it is necessary, particularly at the beginning, to make a personal effort. It may happen that under certain exceptional circumstances, for reasons that wholly escape our intelligence, faith comes as an accident, quite unexpectedly, almost without our having ever asked for it. But more frequently, it is an answer to a desire, a need, an aspiration, something in the being that seeks, wants, even if it is not very conscious or very systematic. In any case, when faith has been granted, when one has this sudden inner illumination, to maintain it constantly in the active consciousness, individual effort is absolutely indispensable. One must hold to one's faith, ask for one's faith, seek it, cultivate it, protect it. The human mind has the morbid and deplorable habit of doubt, discussion, and skepticism. It is there that human effort has to be exercised. One must refuse to admit them, refuse to listen to them, and more than that, refuse to follow them. No game is more dangerous than to play mentally with doubt and skepticism. They are not merely enemies. They are frightful snares, and once you fall into them, you have a formidable difficulty in coming out of them. Some people think that it is a great mental elegance to play with ideas, discuss them, contradict one's faith, that it gives you a very superior attitude, and that you are thus above all superstition and ignorance. But it is in listening to the suggestions of doubt and skepticism that one falls into the grossest ignorance and turns away from the straight path. You enter into confusion and error, into the meanderings of contradictions, and you are not always sure of being able to come out. You stray so far away from the inner truth that you lose sight of it, and at times you also lose all contact with your soul. Certainly there must be a personal effort to preserve one's faith, to let it grow in oneself. Later on, much later, you can one day look behind and see that whatever has happened, even what appeared to be the worst, was a divine grace to make us progress on the path. And then you perceive that the personal effort also was a grace. But before you reach there, you need to walk much, struggle much, at times even to suffer much. One must go farther, one must advance, rise towards greater heights, transcend all hungry seeking for pleasure and personal good, not out of fear for punishment, even otherworldly punishment, but by the growth of a new sense of beauty, a thirst for truth and light, by understanding that it is only by widening oneself, illumining oneself, kindling oneself with the ardor for progress, that one can find at the same time the inner peace and the enduring happiness. One must rise up and widen oneself, rise up and widen oneself. The Mother.